I somehow got through writing this entire script without realizing that this incident occurred just a few miles from where a man who may or may not have been Teddy Roosevelt may or may not have encountered something that may or may not have been Bigfoot.
Allegedly.
I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore. It was around noon on July 18th, 2007, when Carl Bolick's cousin Donna began getting a little antsy. Carl was working on a carpentry project in his Corvallis, Montana home when she walked in asking him if he was concerned about the fact that their spouses had yet to return from a hike in the nearby Bitterroot Mountains outside the nearby town of Victor. Carl checked the time, thought about it for a moment, and then shrugged it off. Victor was about 10 miles up the highway, and the road to the Bear Creek Overlook Trail, where Carl's wife Barbara and Donna's husband Jim planned to hike that morning, was another 10 miles off from there. So just the drive to get there would have taken about an hour due to the winding road up the trail, and the hike itself another 2.5 hours out and back, according to the website AllTrails. They left the house at around 9 a.m., so if anything, Carl expected that it would be another hour or so before they returned. But that hour came and went without any sign of Barbara and Jim. And as 1 hour dragged into an hour and a half, Donna once again began to feel anxious. Carl, however, remained unconcerned. His wife wasn't just an avid hiker, she was a smart one too, and she was very familiar with that particular trail. Having hiked it dozens of times, according to her husband, she knew not to veer off the marked path for any reason, and as much as she loved hiking the Bear Creek Overlook route, her fear of heights kept her from ever getting too close to the precipice. Carl wasn't too worried about foul play either, knowing that his wife kept the .357 Magnum he'd bought for her tucked into her backpack at all times. But Donna, on the other hand, wasn't so confident. Carl tried to reassure her that they probably just had a flat tire or something of the sort, but as time wore on, she only grew more and more upset. So finally, as 2:30 rolled around, she begged Carl to call somebody. He was getting ready to do just that when the phone rang, and on the other end was the United States Forest Service officer. She asked me if my wife's name was Barbara, Carl told Perry Backus of the Missoulian, and I instantly thought something terrible had happened. The ranger told him that Barbara had been reported missing, and Carl told the agent that he would meet her at the trailhead. An hour later, he was standing in the parking lot, looking up the trail towards his wife's favorite place in the world. For the entire hour of that drive, he had been certain that his wife would be there waiting for him. And now that he could see that she wasn't, the gravity of the situation was settling in. Barbara was gone, and that made no sense whatsoever. The Bitterroot Mountains are wild, that much is for sure, but this trail wasn't. Not only that, but Jim, the man who reported her missing, seemed more confused than anybody. All he could tell Carl and the Forest Service was that one moment she'd been there, and the next she was not. There had been no veering off trail, no bathroom break, no ill-advised game of hide and seek. There had been no sound of an animal charging through the brush, nor of loose slate clattering down from a slip. There was no scream, no sign of a struggle. She'd just vanished into thin air in the 40 seconds Jim claimed he didn't have his eyes on her. Running through the possibilities, there's not a ton of good explanations for that. If she'd been abducted, how did the kidnapper manage that so silently and so quickly? If an animal had attacked, where was the blood, and how was it completely silent when every footstep clicked shards of rock against one another? And if she had left of her own accord, something for which Carl felt there could be absolutely no motive, how could she have done so without taking the vehicle or being seen by the Forest Service road crew working in the parking lot? One thing everyone was asking was, could this have anything to do with the two younger men that Jim recalled passing along their trail on their way up to the Overlook? Or did something even less explainable happen to Barbara Bolick in those mountains? But what is explainable is just how convenient today's sponsor, Factor, really is. We've been working with Factor for a very long time, and it's because we genuinely like them as a service. For those who don't know, Factor is a service that delivers full chef-crafted meals that all you gotta do is you take them out of their packaging, you stick them into the microwave for 2 minutes, and then bada bing, bada boom, you got a meal. Personally, my favorite part is that aside from being convenient, it doesn't get boring, which is one thing that you tend to run into with microwavable meals. You know, you'll see there's like 4 or 5 different options that work, and those are what you're kind of restricted to. But with Factor, you get 35 menu options every week, and sometimes even more than that. In addition to that, you can get things like snacks, shakes, smoothies, there's breakfast options. Factor's kind of an all-around gig is the idea here. Now, don't get me wrong, I like a good home-cooked meal, I like to go out for dinner, but sometimes you don't have time to cook, you don't want to deal with getting a $45 meal at a restaurant, so what's better than that? Factor. The average price of a Factor meal is just $12, and the average prep time is, well, it's not average, it's 2 minutes every single time. There's no hassle of worrying about what you want to cook that night, going grocery shopping, calling a place to make a reservation in case you want to get dinner. No, you just reach in, you grab a meal that you specifically decided you were going to want to eat that week, you put it in the microwave, and you're eating. One of my favorite things about Factor is that on the weeks where I'm trying to write 2 scripts at once because we gotta travel or something, I don't have to think about it. I just go and I grab it out of my fridge and it's good to go. They also make it really easy to stick to a diet plan if you're doing something that's high protein. They have a keto program, they have vegetarian options. Amanda has just reminded me they have low carb too. And if you're in the mood for something a little bit special, they have some gourmet options that are really only like a $3 upcharge. Like, they have microwavable steak that's good. Think about that for a second. So, if you would like to see for yourself why we have stuck with Factor as a brand partner for over 2 years now, head to Factor75.com or click the link below and use code 50LoreLodge to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first Factor box. Again, that is code 50LoreLodge at Factor75.com to get 50% off plus shipping on your first box. On the morning of July 18th, 2007, 55-year-old Barbara Bolick and her brother-in-law Jim set out to hike the Bear Creek Overlook Trail outside of Victor, Montana. It was a route she completed many times, and one so dear to her that she made a point of taking anyone and everyone who would accompany her out to see the view of what she felt was one of the most beautiful places in the world. On that morning, she had planned to bring both Jim and his wife Donna along with her, but the effects of a Margarita night the evening prior kept Donna at home with Carl, who had planned to spend the day working on a carpentry project anyway. As far as Carl could remember, his last interaction with her wife before her disappearance was while he was still half asleep at around 8:30 a.m. She came in and told him that she and Jim were going hiking to the overlook, and Carl responded that he would take care of dinner that night. She then said, "I'll see you a little later," left the room, closed the door, and headed out with Jim. Now, according to Jim's recounting of events, the drive to the overlook was mostly uneventful, with the only issue being a road closure sign about half a mile to a mile from the trailhead. It wasn't that there was any issue with the trail, but rather the road itself, which was undergoing routine maintenance on a culvert. So, given that there wasn't a problem with the route they planned to take, Jim and Barbara parked his car by the sign, hopped out, and began to make their way up the trail. Shortly thereafter, a Forest Service road crew arrived to begin the day's work. By this time, they said that there were 2 vehicles parked at the sign, one being Jim's and the other being a light-colored older SUV that could have been a Chevrolet Blazer. The Missoula County plates on the latter identified its owner as being local, and the Forest Service crew thought nothing of it. Nor did they take much notice when 2 young men in their 20s walked down the trail, hopped into the car, and left sometime later. What did draw their attention came approximately 45 minutes to an hour after those 2 drove off, when Jim walked into the site and asked the crew if they'd seen Barbara. They hadn't, but one of the crew members accompanied Jim down to his car to check and see if she'd slipped past them and just arrived back before he did. But she hadn't, so Jim set out to walk back up the trail. The road crew reported that he returned an hour and a half later, now more concerned. Barbara hadn't turned up in his absence, and Jim hadn't found a trace of her anywhere. At this point, the only option was to alert the authorities, who were confident they'd be able to find the missing 55-year-old. Ravalli County Sheriff Chris Hoffman described the Bear Creek Overlook Trail as not the kind of place where a person might take a wrong turn and get lost. According to him, it's a fairly confined area where the trail goes up to an overlook, and that can be corroborated through the images of the route on all trails. It's an up and back deal, the sheriff explained. There's very little opportunity to get lost. And yet, Barbara wasn't on the trail. At least not so far as any of the people who combed it that afternoon could tell. A medical emergency was one of the considerations for why she might not be responding to anyone calling her name, but then again, that wouldn't have taken her off the trail if she hadn't already left. And Jim was pretty certain that she hadn't done that. While speaking to the authorities, he informed them that he and Barbara had no trouble reaching the overlook that morning. Once they arrived, he said they'd spent 30 to 40 minutes up there enjoying the views. And during that time, they had seen the 2 men described by the road crew, along with their dog, and had a brief yet polite conversation before the men moved on. Then, a short while later, Jim and Barbara turned back to head down the hill. This should have been very straightforward, but then Jim turned around to take in a view of the valley and the mountains beyond the precipice one last time. It was a short look, he reported, maybe 45 seconds, maybe a minute, but when he turned back to the trail, Barbara was gone. Jim was confused almost immediately. Barbara had been just 20 to 30 feet from him when he last saw her. She had said nothing about walking off without him, nor had he heard the 115-pound woman's steps on the loose shale. It was as if she'd evaporated, but the only thing he could imagine was that she'd simply gotten far enough down the trail to be out of sight, and had done so very quickly. So, when he got back down to the road sign and no one else had seen her, it was a very perplexing situation for both Jim and the agencies which turned out to help. The response in this case was actually very impressive, with involvement from Forest Service rangers, both Missoula and Ravalli County law enforcement and their search dogs, the Montana National Guard, and even the Department of Homeland Security, who provided specialized Blackhawks equipped with forward-looking infrared technology within the first 48 hours. Like I said, they were confident they were going to find her, and they had very good reason to be. Bear Creek Overlook wasn't tightly timbered, the brush isn't particularly tall or dense, and Barbara was wearing summer clothes. Dogs couldn't find where she'd gone off trail, then the helicopters at least should have picked up her heat signature without much trouble. And yet, neither dogs nor infrared cameras could detect a trace of the missing woman. Of course, if she had passed away, FLIR wouldn't have picked up a cold body. But Barbara was in very good shape and had no history of mental illness. So the only factor which could have contributed to her dying along the trail, so far as anybody could surmise, would have been a heart attack, stroke, or aneurysm. But none of those options were very likely to have taken her off trail even if they had occurred. Searchers had combed the brush surrounding the trail from top to bottom and side to side, but Barbara wasn't anywhere to be seen. And to be clear, this being weird isn't just my opinion as a YouTube creator. Ravalli County Sheriff's investigator Perry Johnson was just as lost. "It's hard to creep quietly across that loose shale rock," Johnson told the Missoulian. "You'd make some noise. Just the fact that somebody simply disappears like that is a cause for concern. I just don't have that life experience," he continued. "How could that possibly happen?" In Johnson's opinion, the most important lead in the case was those two men spotted on the trail by the road crew and by Jim on that day. These were the only people who both parties present that afternoon could confirm were there, and the only others anyone had seen on the trail that day. Johnson was clear that he didn't suspect the men, but he felt that they could have valuable information about the day in question. And there's some interesting subtext there. Obviously, those two didn't have Barbara with them when they came down the trail. They also reportedly left the area by the time Barbara disappeared, and by the looks of things, about 30 to 45 minutes before Jim and Barbara had turned around to come back down the trail. So what relevance could they have? Unless they were lying in wait on the off chance that Barbara and Jim wouldn't leave at the same time, then somehow managed to abduct her while Jim was just 45 seconds to a minute behind her, and then get her far enough off trail to render her invisible to search crews, it doesn't seem like they could have been responsible for her disappearance. What they could do, however, was confirm one detail that, to that point, hadn't been corroborated. That being whether or not Barbara was actually on the trail that day at all. You see, while search dogs aren't 100% reliable, they are pretty good at their jobs as a rule. In many cases, we see that dogs will track a scent for a short time and then lose it, or that they struggle to pick up a trail where it's unclear where someone was. But in this case, dogs weren't able to pick up any scent whatsoever, despite a manicured trail which should have led directly from the car to where she departed the marked path. At the very least, they should have picked up her scent from the car to the trailhead, but they couldn't even do that. Combined with the inability of the Blackhawks to pick up a heat signature and the lack of witnesses besides Jim placing her on the trail, that raises some serious questions. Sheriff Hoffman seems to have held the same suspicions, as he told the Missoulian that the reason he wanted to speak to these men was so they could, at minimum, verify that Barbara was in the area that day. To that end, Carl and his family put out a $10,000 reward for information leading to the identity of and contact with the two men who last saw Bolick, which was added to an additional $5,000 reward offered by the Carol Sund Carrington Foundation, which is a nonprofit in honor of the victims of Cary Stayner, the Yosemite Park killer. Given the local plates on the car driven by the two young men, it should have been no trouble identifying them. Missoula County isn't a particularly populous area, with just around 100,000 residents in total at the time, so even if this were a rental car, then there should have been someone who could identify its drivers. Because I will remind you, a Chevrolet Blazer is not a very common car. But despite all of that, nobody ever came forward, and the mystery of what happened to Barbara Bolick on that day in 2007 remains a mystery. Investigators were clear that Jim remained cooperative throughout the investigation, with Johnson telling the press that until something else happens, he's just a witness, and that there's no evidence he did anything to Barbara. Those words do seem to belie something of an unspoken suspicion, but if he had done this, then it seemed as though he must have done it right before they got to the trailhead, and the only people who could possibly corroborate Jim's story were in the wind. Either Jim committed the perfect crime, or something a lot more mysterious happened to Barbara Bolick out in the wilderness of the Idaho-Montana border. And if that's the case, then it's not those two men who have the answers. It would be the Bitterroot Salish. As I mentioned at the very beginning of this video, there's a rather famous story that takes place just about 40 miles south of Bear Creek Overlook. Frequently known as the Bauman narrative, or the Wendigo story, or a goblin story as it was recorded by Teddy Roosevelt, this is the story we covered last fall, where an old German man recounted a tale to the greatest American president of all time about how he and a friend, while hunting up in the Bitterroots, encountered something. Obviously, we have an entire video on this, and I would encourage you to watch that for the full version of the story, but the short version is as follows. Bauman and his unnamed hunting partner go up into this area, they establish a camp, and on the first night, things start to get weird. They see footprints, and at first they think, oh, it's probably just a bear that was walking around the camp while we were gone. And the camp had also been kind of like ransacked. But then Bauman's partner, as he goes to observe the footprints, calls him over and says, "Bauman, the bear has been walking on two legs." Over the next couple of days, these strange happenings and behaviors continue, and then it all culminates with Bauman's partner being found dead at the camp, apparently the victim of some kind of surprise attack. Now, Roosevelt, who has oftentimes been suggested to be Bauman here, did later tell somebody else that this was not his story, and that, as far as he was concerned, this was probably just two separate animals walking around the camp. A bear had been responsible for, messing everything up, and then a mountain lion had been responsible for the kill. But the weird part was that neither of those animals ate the guy. If this was a bear and a cougar, then the bear just destroyed the camp several times, and the cougar killed the partner without any real reason to do so. He was attacked from behind while he was sitting down, so it wasn't like there was a fight that happened. It wasn't like he shot at it and then it came after him. So it doesn't exactly track with what you expect from a mountain lion kill, and if it had been a bear that killed him, there would have been it would have been a lot messier. Roosevelt, to his credit, was looking for the mundane explanation. He was trying to understand what this could have been without jumping to the idea that it was something supernatural. But at the same time, it really doesn't track with a cougar or a bear attack. So the question you have to ask is, if it wasn't either of those things, what was it? And whatever it was, could it be responsible for what happened to this missing woman? And if that's the case, then it's not those two men on the trail that day who would have the answers. It would be the Bitterroot Salish. Often, stories like that of Barbara Bolick draw questions of supernatural involvement, very frequently with regard to the native legends surrounding the area in which the individual disappeared. For those in the old Algonquian territories of the Northeast and the Great Lakes, the Wendigo is generally the alleged culprit. In New Mexico and Arizona, we see people blame the skinwalkers of Navajo tradition, while in the Pacific Northwest territories, dominated by the Coast Salish people, Sasquatch is responsible. So, in Montana, one would expect that the monsters would be those of the interior Salish people who once dominated the territory. Linguistic relatives of Pacific Northwest nations like the Nisqually, Lummi, Chehalis, and others, the people of the Bitterroot Mountains belong to a tribal confederation known today as the Flathead, though in their language they are called the Salish, after which the languages spoken by their cousins are actually named. Today, one of three tribes who make up the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes of the Flathead Reservation, the Salish people are close cousins of the Pend Oriel, or in their language, the Kalispe, with whom they share much of their history. Now, these are not to be confused with Khaleesi, like in Game of Thrones, or more properly, Daenerys Stormborn of the House Targaryen, the first of her name, the Unburnt, Queen of Meereen, Queen of the Andals and the Rhoynar and the First Men, Khaleesi of the Great Grass Sea, Breaker of Chains, and Mother of Dragons. In any case, the Salish have lived in the Bitterroots since time immemorial, which is about how long it's been since George R.R. Martin released his last book. Okay, now I'm done. According to the tribes of the Salish and Kalispe themselves, their story begins when the Creator put the animal people on this earth. Their legends tell of a time when this creator being sent Coyote and his brother Fox to this big island, as the elders call this land, to rid it of the evils which made it uninhabitable to humans. As with many native stories, Coyote is a trickster being who can be both benevolent or problematic. In this case, he was responsible for providing good and special skills and knowledge for man to use, as well as many faults such as greed, jealousy, hunger, envy, and many other imperfections that we know of today. Along with the story of Coyote and his doings, which include his killing off of the people eaters, along with several other grotesquely sexual stories that I could not repeat on YouTube, the Salish have preserved accounts of the last great ice age, including tales about the retreat of the glaciers which once covered Montana. And unlike many of the more eastern nations, such as the Haudenosaunee or the Anishinaabe, the Salish do not have a migration story. Instead, they believe that they were placed right there in Montana, east of the Continental Divide, by a creator being known as Amot Ken, one of the two deities who rule over the three worlds of Salish cosmology, which themselves are connected by a great tree, the roots of which sink far into the earth, and the top of which reaches the sky. There are some interesting parallels with Norse mythology right there, but we're not going to get into that. Amot Ken ruled the sky world, while his antithesis, and I'm doing my best with the pronunciations here, I'm sorry, Amtep ruled the underworld within the roots of this tree. Now, similar to Zoroastrian beliefs, these beings were dualist in nature. The former deity, along with being the creator, was responsible for things which benefited the people, such as rain and abundance of wildlife, while the latter was described as being a mysterious being who often tries to harm people, to blight the crops, and make game and food scarce. Amot Ken was also the one who commanded Coyote to go and prepare the world for humankind, and was associated with various guardian spirits, while his counterpart had his own wicked beings who formerly inhabited the earth, which now live with him in the underworld. So as you can see, along with Zoroastrianism, there are also some clear parallels with Christianity here, which may be the result of Catholic missions to the area during the middle of the 19th century. The guardian spirits, for example, are reminiscent of both the spirit animals of the nearby yet generally unrelated northern Dene cultures, and the guardian angels of Catholic tradition, as well as some of the lesser deities within Zoroastrianism. Much like the Dene, however, the Salish acquired their guardian spirit at the onset of puberty, though where a Dene individual would have just one, the Salish would endeavor to obtain one or more of them. Another difference, potentially the result of Catholic influence, was that the adolescent Salish individual would go through a training course rather than a vision quest, which involved bathing in running water, fasting, praying, and keeping vigil in lonely places. Once a person acquired their guardian spirits, they would obtain a song, often through the spirit during a dream or vision. If for some reason that was not possible, then the individual would compose their own during their solitude. According to the American Bureau of Ethnology's 45th annual report, these songs were sometimes modifications and new variations of existing ones, and typically described either experiences or wishes for the future. Then, throughout a person's life, they would compose more songs as a way of record keeping, not dissimilar from the skaldic traditions of the Nordic and Germanic peoples of Europe. Songs and spirits carried through all aspects of Salish life, from events like marriage or childbirth to struggles such as famine or war, the latter being the main reason for the restriction of the Salish people to their lands in the Bitterroot Mountains. While the more nomadic Shoshone and Bannock tribes to the west rarely came into conflict with the more sedentary Salish, the same can't really be said for the Blackfeet who lived to their east. Salish country was prime bison hunting territory, and the Algonquian speakers of the Great Plains had something that their western neighbors lacked: firearms, big iron. Having received muskets and then later rifles from the Hudson's Bay Company in the 18th century, the Blackfoot tribes had a considerable advantage in warfare, and they used it to sweep across western Montana beginning around 1775. Shortly thereafter, a smallpox outbreak devastated Salish bands living in the area of present-day Missoula, driving them west into the mountains. By 1782, it's estimated that smallpox had killed off approximately 50 to 70% of Salish and neighboring Kalisped bands, leaving them utterly incapable of fighting back against the Blackfeet. By the time that French and English fur traders made their way into the region, the Salish were a shell of their former power. So when the Lewis and Clark expedition arrived in the Bitterroot Valley in 1805, they were eager to trade for the one thing that could potentially put them on equal terms with their enemies: rifles and reinforcements. Beginning in 1809, the Salish gained regular access to firearms through the establishment of the fur trade in western Montana, while the relocation of the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee following the defeat of their British allies in the American War of Independence bolstered their numbers. The Salish would cede no more land to the Blackfoot, but that didn't mean that they were out of the woods. According to the Salish themselves, sometime between 1700, a prophet named Shining Shirt, whose Salish name I simply cannot pronounce, foresaw the coming of the Black Robes, white men who would teach a new way of prayer. When Catholic missionaries eventually arrived alongside the Iroquois, the Salish recognized them as the prophesied Black Robes and welcomed them into their world, even sending multiple envoys east to request Catholic priests of their own. The Jesuit order subsequently established a mission called St. Mary's under the guidance of Father Pierre-Jean de Smet in 1841, adjacent to a winter camp in the area of modern-day Stevensville, Montana. Over the following decade, however, the Salish felt that the influence of the Catholics was only serving to undermine their traditional practices. By 1849, the Jesuits were driven out, and Salish authority was restored for what would be the last time. In 1855, the Treaty of Hellgate was signed under the authority of President James Buchanan, reserving for the Salish and their cousins a reservation in the Bitterroot Valley with additional hunting grounds for their exclusive use. It seemed to be a victory, but within the decade, a gold rush brought wave after wave of settlers into the region, further diminishing the resources available to the natives. The issues only grew when, in 1871, President Ulysses S. Grant, without sending any surveyors to establish a suitable new location, ordered the removal of the Salish, Kalispel, and Kootenai to a different tract of land called the Jocko Reservation. Tribal leaders agreed to do so on the condition that the United States provide them with new log houses, a side of beef for every family, and plots of land designated specifically for their use, as well as $55,000 in cash. And by 1875, the migration was complete. From that point on, the miseries of the Salish became too numerous to count. The deliberate extermination of their primary food source, bison, crippled their prosperity. Railroads and American settlements boxed them in and reduced their autonomy. And lastly, the appointment of Indian agents stripped them of any true semblance of independence. Perhaps the best way of understanding their plight is to read the words of the late Bishop James O'Connor, who traveled through the Flathead Reservation in June of 1877. Aidan, the solemn mood lighting. "For what redress has the Indian for an abuse of authority on the part of an agent?" he wrote. "The experience of long years has shown that he has none whatsoever. No adequate supervision of the agent is provided for by law. He is alone with his tribe or tribes, and literally monarch of all he surveys. There is, it is true, a physician, there is an interpreter, there are farmers and mechanics, there may be teachers on the reservation, but they all depend on him, or his friends for the positions they hold, and are therefore more likely to screen than oppose his irregularities. Who, then, is to interfere between him and his helpless wards, should he see fit to oppress and fleece them? It is only cases of the most aggravated and cumulative wrongdoing that can ever reach the Department of the Commissioners of Indian Affairs, and even then, what is the remedy? Why, at best, the removal of the agent and the appointment of another who will be sure to walk in his footsteps. Irresponsible authority of this kind is very trying to the virtue of ordinary men. To the dishonest and the depraved, it affords opportunities of practicing every species of injustice. And who does not know that the incumbents of this office have, with only a few exceptions, belonged to precisely these classes? What wonder, then, that they should have administered it solely with a view to their own aggrandizement, and that their heartless inventive rapacity should have driven the poor savage to hopeless utter despair. As for that last term, savage, I think it's worth understanding that O'Connor did not use this in a derogatory, but rather an archaic manner. While today savage pretty consistently means somebody who is uncivilized and violent, in the case of a bishop, it would probably mean something more along the lines of non-Christian. Though I will say that within the entire article, there is a degree of calling them uncivilized. It's a product of the time. And I tell you this because I want to prepare you for some wording that's going to sound very bad, very, very negative, but I want you to see the message through the wording. They were savages, he explained, but savages the misery of whose lot had been made intolerable by the civilization that surrounded them. They were the lords of the soil, but were being driven from it by the rapacity of men who know neither justice, nor pity, nor remorse. Who, with the ordinary instincts of humanity, could see them thus engaged on a soil that, but for the injustice of the white man, would now yield them golden harvests, and not be touched with compassion for them, and not think it a reproach to belong to the race that oppressed them. Again, these were the words of the Irish-American Bishop James O'Connor of Omaha, Nebraska. You see, of all the tribes with which the American settlers contested, the Salish were one of the few who can truly be described as entirely innocent of their fate. Where the Iroquois and the Algonquians fought one another and took sides in the conflicts of Europeans, where the migrating Lakota and Comanche raided and drove others from their lands, and where the Paiute and the Ute fought bloody wars of conquest against their indigenous neighbors, the Salish did nothing to attract the terrible injustices which ultimately befell them. They were the victims of a world which changed too fast for them to adapt, of tribes which recognized their inferior technology, and of an expanding American empire which saw them as unworthy of being treated with dignity. Tragically, Bishop O'Connor's advice was that the affairs of Indians should be put into the hands of the military, for he was of the belief that the officers of our army understand the Indian better than any other class of men in the country. They appreciate his good qualities, make proper allowance for his faults, sympathize with him, admire him, and do not despair of the possibility of elevating him from his present degraded and helpless condition. Were the Indians allowed to occupy their ancestral homes or hunting grounds, he elaborated, or to live on the reservations assigned them at proper distance from military outposts, with missionaries of their choice and under their own tribal laws and customs, were supplies furnished them through the nearest quartermaster, and traders forbidden to deal with them or even approach them, except once or twice a year at the posts, and under the supervision of the local officers, were the local commander instructed, as in the British possessions, to require them to keep the peace amongst themselves and with surrounding tribes, and to protect them against the white settlers, the Indian question, I am quite sure, would soon find an easy and satisfactory solution. As history would prove within the decade, this well-intentioned advice would prove to be the worst possible idea. You see, the Salish did have monsters of their own, these ancient people-eaters which sound somewhat like those described by the Dene to the north and the Paiute to the south. But in the experiences of those who were able to pass down stories to those of us living today, the most relevant monsters were not the things that go bump in the night. Instead, they were the most terrifying, most real monster of them all, their fellow man. Due to the unyielding ambitions of native and settler alike, the Salish of today live amongst their Pend d'Oreille and Kootenai Confederates on the Flathead Reservation in northwestern Montana, just an hour's drive from the little town of Victor in the Bitterroot Valley. And it was from that little town that Barbara Bolick stepped out onto the Bear Creek Overlook Trail, walked out into the mountainous wilderness, and vanished into thin air. What does seem clear is that Barbara did not leave that trail of her own volition, nor did she suffer some kind of medical emergency as she made her way down. But as for what really did happen, and whether it was man or monster which caused her to disappear, we may never really know. With all of that said, if you would like to support what we do here at the Lore Lodge, there are a number of ways you can do that. And I do hope that you appreciated the return of the history segment, because I know I enjoyed actually getting to write one. And if you're really grateful that the history segment came back, then you can check us out on Patreon and give us $1. And if you do it every month, that would be super cool too. That'll get you access to a whole bunch of exclusive content that we actually are in the process of finally producing, as well as, helping us just run the channel and make upgrades and do the things we need to do to make these videos better and better. I do want to acknowledge that if you're more of a new viewer, then the second half to last third of this video may have seemed a little out of place. We used to do history segments in just about every single video we put out, and to be honest, I missed doing it, and this was a great opportunity because we hadn't covered this region before. For those who have been watching for a long time, you probably remember these, and I hope that you appreciated it coming back, because I genuinely enjoyed doing it. I'm hoping to rework these into videos in the future, and it would actually be good for me to know if you would prefer them to be earlier in the video like they used to be, or to have them come at the end like we did here and with the Jordan Grider video back in November-ish. So please let me know in the comments if you want history at the beginning or history at the end. And, I mean, if you want to tell me that you hate history, I guess that's okay too. But no matter your opinion on the history segment, if you want to support what we do here at the Lore Lodge, you can do so in a number of ways. The most direct is to head over to Patreon and subscribe to us right over there. It is $1 a month. We have a whole bunch of exclusive content that we're shooting this summer, and we are really excited to get that out to you. When we say exclusive content, I want to be clear, all of it will be safe for work. There will be a calendar that may or may not be safe for work, but that will be available for sale elsewhere. So the Patreon is totally cool exclusive content, not that kind of exclusive content. I don't like that I have to make this disclaimer now. But if instead of consuming content, you would like to consume our beans, you can do so by going to TableauRoastingCo.com and purchasing Mount Pocono Perk, our signature coffee blend. I designed it myself. I told Matt Moore down there exactly what beans I wanted, from what region I wanted, and at what temperature I wanted them roasted, and he made a blend. It is a perfect blend. I love this blend. But if you're less into consuming us and you more want to wear our skin, you can do so by going to bunkerbranding.com and scrolling on down to the Lore Lodge section where you can buy our merch. It is comfy cozy, it is well designed, and it supports American made. I'm American made, he's American made, Archie's American made, and the shirts are American made. We're also working on getting some Mothman themed political merchandise. Make America Moth-a-Man, if you will. If you're looking for more Lodge, you can get that by watching our live show, which is a lot more conversational and off-topic. Some people like that, some people hate it. The important part is that it's not this show, and I want you to understand that before you watch it. That also goes up on podcasting platforms every Wednesday morning, early in the morning, and we're working on getting these videos up on Spotify as well. Well, all podcast platforms, really. Aiden's just, he needs help. Why does he need help, you might ask? Well, it's because we have this show, we have the live show, we have History Unhinged, we have the Weird Bible. All of these are their own channels, by the way. And then we have my personal channel, Aiden Mattis, which he doesn't do, and I do when I can. And I know I just threw a lot at you, so if you're hoping to keep up with any of that, the best way to do it is through our Discord server, which you can reach by going to bit.ly/jointhelodge or clicking the link in the description. With all of that said, I'm Aiden Mattis, and thank you for stopping by the Lore Lodge.